How does pastoral counseling help people change? The process of change is complex and organic with many interacting factors. In a narrative sense, change can be described in the terms of a story: who, when, how, what, and why. Those seeking care, persons, families, or organizations, change in the process of spiritual care, and so do pastoral counselors. In a relational sense, the ripple effects of change spread throughout webs of relationships, inclusive of families, communities, and social systems. When a community of faith offers a service of healing that is personally and communally empowering, the effects reverberate throughout the persons, couples, families, religious leaders, communities of faith, and even beyond. People change when they are ready. Emotions, values, beliefs, and spiritual practices play an important role in ambivalence about and readiness for change. Care seekers need to be able to identify the emotional triggers that coalesce lived theology of emotionally charged values, beliefs, and habitual ways of coping. Once these triggers and subsequent lived theologies are compassionately identified and understood, care seekers will be more able to explore the pros and cons of change. They can consciously choose how they want to respond to emotional triggers. Change is more likely when personal, family, and organizational dynamics shift from ambivalence toward readiness for change, and when there are opportunities, resources, and skills supporting change. Change is going to be more challenging when personal, familial, and cultural dynamics support the status quo and weigh heavily against change. Pastoral care begins when listening to stories in order to explore underlying values, beliefs, and coping practices that shape faith. Helping care seekers identify their ambivalence about change is the first step in respectfully helping them see what might move them out of this pre-contemplation stage. Spiritual care provides a theological basis for contemplating change and identifying the faith embedded in care seekers' stories. What theology, emotionally charged values, beliefs, and spiritual practices do care seekers want to live out? These questions illustrate the timing of the change process is inherently theological and not based on a process of psychological change. Change becomes possible when helping relationships are trusting, respectful, and compassionate. Psychological research identifies the most significant factor in therapeutic change as the therapeutic alliance. The quality of the collaborative work between care seeker and counselor, and how well the pastoral counselor's ways of helping interface with the client's goals and expectations. In terms of pastoral care, it is not just this respectful, compassionate relationship that helps people change. Change is facilitated by the working relationship negotiated between the pastoral counselor and the care seeker's goals and expectations. One goal of pastoral counseling is an integration of the care seeker's core values, ultimate beliefs, and spiritual practices which emerge from the care seeker's narrative. These values, beliefs, and practices are embodied, physically experienced, and emotionally charged. Pastoral counselors need to listen to how a story is told through the storyteller's body language and reactions and emotions. Once these emotionally charged values, beliefs, and practices are identified, they can be evaluated in terms of whether they are life-giving or life-limiting for care seekers, their relationships, and families. Shame in the care seeker's story may connect with values shaped by racism and sexism, like isolated stoicism, exemplified by a father who represses and disavows shame. These socially shaped values might be linked with beliefs in personal unworthiness and sinfulness connected to the core of one's being. Punitive moral theologies that focus on personal blame will stifle self-compassion and augment chronic spiritual struggles, resulting in isolated suffering. Rather than focusing on meaning-making as the catalyst for change, Carrie Doring proposes that spiritual practices foster self-compassion begin as an embodied experience of change. When compassion is experienced physically, emotionally, and relationally, care seekers can move toward embodied theologies of compassion that embrace shame. Spiritual practices that foster self-compassion alleviate the punitive judgment, internalized prejudices, and spiritual anxieties that cut people off from love. Self-love, God's love, relational, and communal love. Through symbolization, reaching out, and retelling, pain becomes more bearable because as new meanings are constructed in relationship, the burden is shared and God's compassionate presence is experienced. A care seeker's faith must be experienced through compassion-based spiritual practices. Grace, hope, trust, and love need to be experienced physiologically through personal and communal spiritual practices that help people lovingly acknowledge their fear, guilt, and shame. Spiritual integration connects intentional faith with compassion-based practices in order to tenderly recognize one's embedded theologies as well as sources of wisdom and insight into one's suffering and the suffering world. Relationships of trust and compassionate respect open care seekers and pastoral counselors up to mystery, which prompts change in their religious world. As pastoral counselors help care seekers identify and evaluate the embedded religious meaning and values they are putting into practice. Intentional values and beliefs are integrated with spiritual practices, fostering compassion and an enduring sense of goodness. Holistic integration is embodied and comprehensive, taking into the account the full range of emotions that are part of one's religious world from one moment to the next. Theological reflection is a key component of spiritual integration, a means for compassionately understanding how embodied theologies of fear, guilt, shame, rage, and despair have been internalized through interacting social systems of privilege and disadvantage. The end result of change is an integrated, intentional theology of compassion that is liberating, personally, relationally, and communally. Such deeply embodied spiritual integration connects head and heart within the context of understanding the formative role of spiritual systems. Meaning-making on its own will not be enough to change emotionally triggered theologies formed in childhood. Constructing life-giving theologies that one tries to intentionally live out will not diffuse automatic stress-related default theologies. People of faith might feel more inadequate, discouraged, and shamed when the intentional theologies they are trying to put into practice don't change the childhood theologies of fear and shame they still experience. When embedded values and beliefs become emotionally charged in a crisis, care seekers will be able to identify these harbingers of the past and assess whether they enhance or limit spiritual coping and meaning-making. Care seekers are more likely to experience life-giving faith grounded in compassion when they enter into spiritual care relationships with pastoral counselors. Experiencing the healing power of life-giving faith of compassion will cast in high relief embedded life-limiting theologies. Care seekers can learn to compassionately acknowledge the place of such life-limiting embedded theologies within their religious worlds, and then they can choose which meanings and practices are most life-giving. This ongoing process of theological reflection and integration helps care seekers face the complexity and ambiguity of suffering with compassion and resiliency. The goal of spiritual care is spiritual integration that aligns practices, beliefs, and values in a way that liberate persons, families, and communities. What changes through pastoral counseling? An individual is changed in terms of one's practical theology. Change often begins to occur emotionally and physically as a practical theology is identified and its emotional and embodied nature becomes more conscious. In summary, change happens when pastoral relationships help people integrate and embody spiritual practices that foster goodness and compassion with beliefs and values complex enough to account for one's suffering. If the goals of pastoral counseling are spiritual integration, then the process of change involves trusting, respectful, and compassionate helping relationships that open people up to the mystery of goodness inherent in life. Together, pastoral counselors and care seekers will assess the ways care seekers make sense of life and connect this sense of goodness and mystery in times of suffering and joy. Care seekers will begin to integrate life-giving ways of knowing and connecting with the sacred. The ripple effects of change will spread throughout the webs of relationships as they put their beliefs and values into practice.